America was not inevitable. It was mistake that somehow worked against all reasonable expectations about colonial ventures' survival prospects when examining catastrophic decisions that early settlers made repeatedly. Opens by smashing myth that colonies were destined to become great nation through divine providence or superior planning, historical mythology obscuring reality that colonial success resulted from luck and persistence rather than from wisdom or careful preparation that proper colonial administration would have employed. Shows how early colonial years were filled with catastrophic decisions, including building settlements in disease-ridden locations, refusing to grow food during planting seasons, arriving in winter without adequate supplies, and provoking conflicts with militarily superior indigenous powers. That should have wiped settlers out completely through starvation, disease, warfare, or economic collapse that destroyed most colonial ventures when examining global colonization patterns where failure was more common than success. Sets tone by acknowledging that America exists not because of wisdom possessed by colonial leaders whose decisions often violated common sense and whose planning failed to anticipate predictable problems, but because somehow worst ideas didn't kill colonial populations completely despite death rates exceeding 80% in some settlements and despite repeated crises that would have ended less persistent colonial efforts. Didn't kill colonies immediately allowed sufficient time for accidents, alliances, and environmental luck to create circumstances where survival became possible despite settlers' poor decisions. It threw combination of indigenous assistance that colonists had not earned, geographic advantages that planning had not anticipated, resupply from Europe that arrived at critical moments, and settlers' stubborn refusal to abandon ventures despite suffering that rational calculations suggested justified retreat. Somehow suggesting that colonial survival was improbable outcome rather than expected result when examining decisions that settlers made, their success contradicting logical predictions about ventures' futures. Worked meaning colonies eventually stabilized and prospered despite early catastrophic failures that killed majority of initial settlers, long-term success being achieved through surviving critical early years when poor decisions should have produced complete failure, but instead produced casualties, followed by persistence that eventually created stable settlements whose existence contemporary observers found surprising, given settlers demonstrated incompetence during founding periods when survival seemed impossible. Choosing Disease Swamp as capital was Virginia Company's decision in 1607 when selecting Jamestown's site whose location combined multiple disadvantages that proper colonial planning would have avoided. The Virginia Company builds Jamestown on peninsula, whose marshy terrain created ideal breeding habitat for mosquitoes carrying malaria. Site selection, prioritizing defensive advantages over health considerations that should have been paramount when establishing permanent settlement. On malaria-infested marshland, where standing water and warm climate created conditions producing epidemic disease rates among settlers who lacked immunity to tropical diseases that European populations had not encountered previously. Infested, suggesting mosquito populations were dense enough that malaria transmission was virtually guaranteed for anyone remaining at site during summer months, when insect activity peaked. With brackish water whose salt content made it undrinkable without distillation that settlers could not perform easily, site's tidal position, meaning that fresh water was unavailable locally and that water supply depended on upstream sources or on rain collection. Brackish indicating mixture of salt and fresh water that was unsafe for drinking even when boiled, poor water quality contributing to dysentery and other waterborne illnesses that killed colonists throughout early years. And no farmland because marshy terrain and poor soil made agriculture difficult or impossible without extensive drainage and soil improvement that settlers lacked resources and knowledge for implementing. No farmland meant colonists would depend entirely on imported food or on indigenous trade for survival, making self-sufficiency impossible at site, whose selection had prioritized military defense against Spanish attacks over practical considerations about food production and water quality that would determine whether settlers could survive long enough that defense became relevant concern rather than being moot when disease and starvation killed colonists before enemies could attack. Settlement whose location was strategically defensible, but agriculturally and epidemiologically catastrophic. Starvation, cannibalism, and colony that should have died characterized Jamestown's early years, when death rates from disease and malnutrition repeatedly reduced population to fractions of original numbers. Jamestown loses 80 to 90% of its population during multiple crises when supply ships were delayed, when indigenous trade was disrupted, and when disease epidemics killed colonists faster than new arrivals could replace them. Repeatedly meaning catastrophic die-offs occurred multiple times rather than being single crisis that might be dismissed as exceptional bad luck. Pattern of repeated population collapses, demonstrating that site selection and management were fundamentally flawed. 80 to 90% losses, meaning only 10 to 20% of colonists survived crisis periods, mortality rates exceeding what most colonial ventures could absorb, while maintaining organizational cohesion necessary for continued operation. Yet somehow endures through combination of persistent resupply from England that continued despite news of catastrophic mortality reaching investors, and through indigenous assistance that prevented complete starvation even when relations were hostile. Long enough to stabilize after nearly 2 decades of repeated crises, finally produced adaptations, including tobacco cultivation that generated profits, justifying continued investment despite earlier failures. To stabilize meant achieving population growth and economic viability that earlier years' catastrophic mortality had made seem impossible, when rational investors should have abandoned venture after early disaster reports reached England. Somehow captures improbability that Jamestown survived when examining death rates that destroyed colonists' families and that eliminated most institutional knowledge with each die-off, making continued survival dependent on new arrivals rather than on experienced colonists who had mostly died from diseases and starvation that Jamestown's location and management had produced through site selection and agricultural failures that should have convinced Virginia Company to relocate settlement to healthier location with better farmland rather than persisting at site that killed colonists reliably year after year. Gentlemen who thought labor was below them comprised significant portion of Jamestown's early settlers, their presence reflecting Virginia Company's misconception that American colonization would resemble Spanish conquests, where indigenous labor performed agriculture and where Europeans supervised rather than working manually. The earliest settlers include noblemen whose social status in England had exempted them from manual labor and who expected that American settlement would maintain class distinctions, preventing them from performing agricultural work. Who refused to plant crops despite facing starvation. Their class prejudices, being stronger than survival instincts when planting, seemed socially degrading, activity inappropriate for gentlemen. Hunt, despite abundant game in surrounding forests being available for anyone willing to spend time learning hunting skills and pursuing animals, noblemen's refusal to hunt reflecting belief that such activities were beneath their dignity. Or work at all in sense of performing any productive labor that might have contributed to colonies' survival through building shelters, gathering firewood, fishing, or performing other tasks necessary for sustaining settlement. At all meaning complete abstention from productive activity, gentlemen preferring starvation to accepting that American conditions required abandoning English class distinctions about appropriate work for nobility. Below them, in social hierarchy that England maintained, but that American wilderness made irrelevant when survival required everyone capable of working to contribute labor, regardless of birth status. Thought labor was degrading even when facing death from starvation, that their refusal to work was producing, class consciousness being so ingrained that dying seemed preferable to performing manual labor that English society reserved for lower classes, making gentlemen's presence actively harmful to colonies' survival when they consumed food without producing anything valuable, while simultaneously creating social tensions with working colonists who resented feeding people who curd. Refused to contribute labor necessary for settlement survival in environment where everyone's work was essential. The starving time was period from 1609 to 1610, when Jamestown's population collapsed from approximately 500 colonists to 60 survivors, mortality rate exceeding 90% during single winter, when food supplies were exhausted, and when indigenous blockade prevented hunting or foraging outside fort. A death rate that should have ended Virginia permanently by eliminating sufficient population for maintaining settlements' viability, and by demonstrating to investors that venture was hopeless failure not worth continued support. Hundreds die from starvation and from diseases that malnutrition made fatal. Death toll, including majority of colonists who had arrived during previous year, expecting to find established settlement, but instead finding desperate conditions. Die from combination of inadequate food rations and from illnesses that well-fed people might have survived. Malnutrition weakening immune systems, making settlers vulnerable to infections that healthy populations would have resisted successfully. The colony collapses organizationally when leadership died or lost authority, and when survivors were too weak for maintaining defensive structures or for organizing collective activities necessary for continued resistance. Collapses, meaning Jamestown ceased functioning as organized settlement and became merely collection of starving individuals waiting for death or rescue, social order dissolving, when deprivation eliminated capacity for maintaining discipline. And only last-second supply ship prevents total abandonment when survivors were actually sailing away from Jamestown, intending to abandon site permanently before encountering relief expedition in Chesapeake Bay. Prevents abandonment through arriving literally as survivors were evacuating, timing being coincidental rather than planned, when supply expedition had been delayed by Atlantic weather and had arrived weeks later than scheduled, making rescue accidental convergence rather than intentional salvation of settlement that leadership had believed was lost completely, when previous supply ships had failed to arrive during critical period, when stored food was exhausted, when starvation was killing colonists daily. Landing in December with no shelter and no supplies was Pilgrim's catastrophic timing when arriving at Cape Cod in 1620 after transatlantic voyage had been delayed by ship problems and by disagreements about destination. The Pilgrims arrive in winter rather than in spring or summer, when colonization planning would have suggested for maximizing time available for building shelters and planting crops before winter's arrival. Sick from months aboard ship where cramped conditions and inadequate nutrition had produced scurvy and other deficiency diseases, passengers arriving in weakened condition rather than in robust health that establishing new settlement would require. Cold from exposure to North Atlantic winter weather without adequate clothing for New England's more severe climate than England's, temperature difference, making survival more difficult than colonists had anticipated based on similar latitude. And unprepared because they lacked adequate tools, building materials, seeds for spring planting, and preserved food for surviving winter before agriculture could begin, supply inadequacies, reflecting poor planning, and reflecting ships' cramped cargo capacity that limited what colonists could transport. Unprepared thoroughly in sense that virtually every category of supplies necessary for winter survival was inadequate, making their situation desperate immediately upon arrival. The worst timing imaginable for establishing new settlement in climate where winter was most dangerous season for people lacking shelter, arriving in December meant that Pilgrims would face several months of cold weather before they could plant crops or build adequate housing, imaginable suggesting that no reasonable planning would have produced such poor timing. December arrival being result of delays and poor decisions rather than being intentional choice that acknowledged winter colonization's extreme dangers for unprepared settlers who would face months of exposure and food shortage before. Spring allowed agricultural activities that might have made settlement viable if they could survive initial winter that arrived immediately upon landing. Half colony dead by spring was Plymouth's outcome when winter diseases and exposure killed approximately 50 of 100 colonists who had landed in December 1620, mortality rate of 50%, representing catastrophic loss that would have ended most colonial ventures. Disease and exposure kill through combination of respiratory infections, spread in crowded common house, where all colonists initially sheltered, and through hypothermia, affecting people whose inadequate housing and clothing failed to protect them from New England winter. Kill 50% through sustained mortality from December through March, when deaths occurred almost daily. survivors being too weak and demoralized for maintaining normal activities or for providing adequate care for sick who died from lack of nursing and from lack of medicines that European cities would have provided. 50% losses, meaning colonies' viability was questionable, even among survivors who were traumatized by watching half their community die during single winter. The colony should have ended here through combination of high mortality, destroying colonists' morale, and through eliminating sufficient population for performing labor necessary for agriculture and defense, 50 survivors being barely adequate for maintaining settlement. Here at moment when reasonable assessment would have concluded that venture had failed, and that evacuation should be arranged for survivors whose suffering had been extreme and whose future prospects seemed hopeless. But survives through unexpected alliances with Wampanoag, whose assistance teaching agriculture and providing food supplies prevented complete starvation among survivors who lacked knowledge for growing crops in New England's climate and soil. Through unexpected suggesting colonists had not planned on or earned indigenous assistance that proved essential for their survival, Wampanoag aid being providential rather than being result of colonists' diplomatic skill or preparedness, making Plymouth's survival dependent on indigenous generosity that colonists had done nothing to deserve, but that saved settlement from failure that seemed certain after winter's catastrophic mortality had reduced population. Below level, where self-sufficiency seemed achievable without outside assistance. Creating colony that exiled half its own people was Massachusetts Bay Colony's approach to governance under Puritan theocracy established in 1630s, religious rigidity producing constant conflicts with colonists whose beliefs or behaviors deviated from strict orthodoxy. The Puritans build society so rigid that it cannot tolerate any dissent from religious doctrines or any questioning of ministerial authority. Theological inflexibility, creating environment where free thinking was punishable offense. That it exiles dissenters whose theological disagreements with orthodox Puritanism made them targets for banishment rather than for persuasion or tolerance. Colony's leadership, preferring to expel questioners rather than debating doctrinal points. Dissenters, including people like Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson, whose intelligence and religious sincerity made them dangerous to orthodoxy that demanded conformity rather than encouraging independent thought about religious matters. Thinkers whose education and reasoning abilities made them likely to question doctrines that close examination revealed as inconsistent or unsupported by Scripture that Puritans claimed as sole authority. Intellectual capacity being liability in society that valued obedience over understanding, and skilled laborers whose economic value should have made colonies' leadership reluctant to exile them, but whose religious nonconformity was considered more dangerous than their economic loss, theological purity being prioritized over practical considerations about colonies' material welfare. Exiles, half suggesting that significant portion of most capable colonists were driven away through religious intolerance, colony weakening itself through losing talented people whose skills and intelligence would have strengthened settlement. Its own people, meaning colony, was harming itself through exiling members who had contributed to initial settlement and who possessed valuable knowledge and skills. Self-destructive policy, reflecting religious fanaticism that prioritized theological conformity over colonies' practical success, making Massachusetts distinctive for systematically expelling people who might have been assets in more tolerant society that valued capability over doctrinal orthodoxy. The irony was that exiles billed rest of New England rather than disappearing from history or returning to England as Massachusetts leaders might have hoped when expelling dissenters. Rhode Island, founded by Roger Williams in 1636, after his banishment for questioning Puritan doctrines about church-state relations, his colony establishing religious tolerance that contrasted sharply with Massachusetts theocracy. Connecticut, settled partly by Thomas Hooker and followers who left Massachusetts, seeking less restrictive religious environment, their departure representing voluntary exile from colony whose rigidity they found oppressive, and parts of New Hampshire, founded by colonists escaping Massachusetts orthodoxy or seeking economic opportunities in territories where religious conformity was not enforced as strictly as in Puritan heartland, are founded by those cast out of Massachusetts whose exile became catalyst for establishing new colonies rather than ending their American ventures. Exile's persistence, demonstrating determination that Massachusetts had failed to break through persecution. Those cast out, meaning Massachusetts policies, directly caused creation of competing colonies rather than strengthening Puritan settlement through eliminating dissent, ironic outcome being opposite of what intolerant policies intended. The mistake spreads American settlement through scattering talented colonists across New England rather than concentrating them in single location. Massachusetts' intolerance accelerating regional colonization by forcing exiles to establish new settlements. Instead of shrinking colonial presence through driving away dissidents, religious persecution expanded English settlement through motivating exiles to create alternative communities rather than abandoning America, making Massachusetts' theocracy accidentally effective colonization policy despite being motivated by religious fanaticism rather than by strategic planning about expanding English territorial claims. Spread settlement, meaning mistake, produced beneficial outcome contrary to intentions. Colonies founded by exiles, eventually becoming economically and politically important rather than failing, as Massachusetts might have expected when expelling dissenters, whose settlements demonstrated that religious tolerance was viable. Alternative to theocratic governance, vindicating exiles' beliefs while undermining Massachusetts' claims that strict orthodoxy was necessary for colonial success. Colonists pick fight with superior indigenous power when New England settlements provoked Pequot War in 1636 through series of disputes about trade, land, and murders that escalated into military conflict. Early New England provokes major conflict through demanding justice for murdered traders in ways that insulted Pequot sovereignty, and through forming alliances with Pequot enemies that were obviously preparations for war rather than for peaceful coexistence. With Pequot, whose confederation controlled valuable wampum production and fur trade routes, making them wealthy by indigenous standards and capable of fielding large military forces. A wealthy indigenous power whose economic resources allowed them to maintain alliance networks and to equip warriors with firearms obtained through Dutch trade, making Pequot militarily formidable opponents. Powerful confederacy whose political organization exceeded most indigenous groups and whose military capabilities had been proven through defeating neighboring peoples, Pequot dominance in region, making English provocation strategically foolish. Militarily advanced through possessing firearms and through tactical sophistication developed during conflicts with other indigenous peoples, Pequot warriors being experienced fighters whose skills exceeded English militia's limited training. Confederacy suggesting political unity that allowed Pequot to coordinate large-scale military operations rather than fighting as independent villages, organizational advantages, making them dangerous enemies for divided English settlements. Pick fight recklessly through issuing ultimatums that Pequot considered insulting and through military preparations that made peaceful resolution impossible. English provocations reflecting overconfidence about their military superiority and reflecting misunderstanding of Pequot's strength that should have counseled diplomatic caution rather than aggressive posturing that escalated tensions into war that colonists risked losing if Pequot military capabilities exceeded English defensive capacities in region where English settlements were scattered and vulnerable to coordinated indigenous attacks. A war that should have erased English New England began with Pequot attacks on isolated settlements that killed colonists and demonstrated indigenous military capabilities exceeding what English had anticipated. Poor planning by colonial militia whose initial expeditions achieved little while suffering casualties. Military amateurism, nearly producing disasters when English forces became lost or when they encountered stronger Pequot forces than intelligence had suggested. And near disasters, including ambushes that killed English soldiers and including failed assaults on fortified Pequot villages, tactical setbacks, demonstrating that war's outcome was uncertain despite English firearms advantages. Nearly end colonies through sustained Pequot military pressure, threatening to overwhelm English defensive capabilities, indigenous attacks, forcing colonists to abandon outlying settlements and to concentrate in fortified towns where they could defend against assaults. But alliances with Narragansett and Mohegan peoples, who were Pequot enemies, provided English with indigenous allies, whose military support was essential for eventual victory, allied warriors outnumbering English forces and providing scouting and tactical knowledge that English lacked. Luck in timing when Pequot were weakened by smallpox epidemic that reduced their population before war began, disease creating demographic disadvantage that English exploited through attacking when Pequot were vulnerable. And brutality during Mystic Massacre, when English and Allied forces attacked fortified village, killing hundreds of Pequot, including women and children, assaults violence exceeding indigenous warfare norms and shocking even English allies. Lead to survival through eliminating Pequot military power that massacre destroyed along with killing significant portion of Pequot population, brutality succeeding militarily despite moral costs that some English questioned, war's outcome being English victory that was not inevitable based on initial military capabilities, but that resulted from indigenous alliances and from willingness to employ total war tactics that devastated Pequot completely rather than achieving limited military objectives that previous colonial indigenous conflicts had pursued. Giving away land to anyone who could import servants was headright system's basic mechanism, starting in 1618, policy granting 50 acres per person transported to Virginia with intention of encouraging immigration and agricultural development. This creates massive plantations when wealthy investors imported dozens or hundreds of servants and claimed corresponding land grants, accumulated acreage producing large estates rather than small family farms that policy supposedly encouraged. Indentured servitude as labor system, when servants worked for masters for years to repay transportation costs, their bound labor being nearly slavery in conditions, if not in legal status, when servants' rights were minimal and when masters controlled their lives completely. And dangerous class divisions between wealthy planters who controlled thousands of acres and former servants who completed indentures only to discover that good land was monopolized by established planters, inequality, creating resentments that would produce violence. Creates meaning headright system directly caused social stratification, rather than being neutral land policy, whose implementation produced unintended consequences. Systems design favoring wealthy investors over common colonists. Mass inequality in land ownership that concentrated Virginia's best tobacco lands in few hands while leaving majority of population landless or possessing marginal properties, economic disparities exceeding what England experienced and creating volatile social conditions. Massive suggesting estates whose sizes were unprecedented in English experience, plantation scale being enabled by headright grants that accumulated into holdings measured in thousands rather than hundreds of acres. Plantations emerging as dominant agricultural organization, because only large-scale production could profitably employ dozens of bound laborers, whose maintenance costs required extensive cultivation for generating returns, justifying investment in importing servants, system creating economic logic, favoring consolidation rather than encouraging diverse yeoman agriculture that might have produced more stable social structure without extreme wealth concentration that headright system produced through allowing unlimited land accumulation by investors who could import sufficient servants for claiming vast acreages. Bacon's rebellion was uprising in 1676 when former indentured servants and poor farmers rebelled against Virginia's government, their grievances including land monopolization by wealthy planters and including government's refusal to authorize aggressive military action against indigenous peoples. The policy creates uprising through producing class of landless former servants whose economic frustrations and whose racial animosities toward indigenous peoples made them willing to rebel against colonial government that they believed protected wealthy elites' interests while ignoring common colonists' demands. That burns Jamestown when rebels captured Virginia's capital and destroyed it in symbolic rejection of government authority, destruction representing rebellion's seriousness and representing threat to colonial stability, and nearly destroys colony through months of violence that killed dozens and that paralyzed government until English troops arrived to suppress rebellion, uprising, demonstrating that headright system's inequality had created dangerous social tensions. but also pushes reforms, including shifting from indentured servitude toward African slavery as labor system, transition being motivated partly by desire to avoid future rebellions by armed former servants who would be replaced by enslaved workers whose permanent bondage eliminated problem of accumulating landless free population. That accidentally stabilize America's future through eliminating immediate rebellion risk, even while creating long-term problems from slavery's expansion, reforms' stabilizing effect being temporary rather than permanent solution. Accidentally, because reforms were responses to immediate crisis rather than being carefully planned policies for long-term stability, stabilization, occurring despite rather than because of intentions behind changes. America's future through establishing labor and social patterns that would persist for centuries. Bacon's rebellion representing crisis that transformed Virginia from society based on temporary bound labor towards slave society, whose racial divisions would shape American development for next 200 years, making rebellion significant despite its military failure, because social changes it prompted altered fundamental character of colonial labor systems and social structures. America survived because it should have died becomes paradoxical explanation when examining colonial history, showing that settlements persisted despite repeated catastrophic failures. The colonies made suicidal decisions again and again, including choosing disease-ridden settlement sites, refusing to grow food during planting seasons, provoking wars with militarily superior enemies, and creating social systems producing violent internal conflicts. Choices that should have wiped them out through starvation, disease, military defeat, or social collapse that destroyed most colonial ventures facing comparable challenges. American survival being statistically improbable when examining failure rates for European colonization attempts globally. Yet through luck, including arriving during period when indigenous populations were weakened by epidemics, through indigenous alliances that colonists had not earned through diplomacy but that they received nonetheless, through geography, providing defensive advantages and agricultural potential, and through sheer human stubbornness, refusing to abandon ventures despite suffering that rational calculation suggested justified evacuation. They survived, meaning persistence, overcame incompetence when examining colonists' decisions whose quality did not justify success that occurred anyway through fortunate circumstances. America wasn't born of brilliance in planning or execution, but was born of disaster that settlers somehow survived through combination of luck and refusal to quit. Of disaster describing repeated crises that killed thousands and that eliminated majority of early settlers whose deaths demonstrated that colonial decisions were fundamentally flawed, and refusal to let disaster win characterized survivors' determination to persist despite evidence suggesting that ventures were hopeless, stubbornness being essential quality, allowing colonization to succeed, when wisdom would have counseled abandonment of settlements whose death rates and economic failures made them seem like catastrophic mistakes, that persistence, somehow, transformed into foundations for nation whose existence resulted not from inevitable historical forces, but from colonists' refusal to accept that their terrible decisions should have produced complete failure rather than eventual success. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a positive comment below. It really helps the channel grow and keeps these stories coming.